Chapter 11. Silence fell, and Mr. Higgins, with the unhappy Nate following him, had gone. John moved first, making for where Kit still stood beside the gun, only to find his way blocked by Chavez Barton's massive chest. Mr. Torse elbowed Chavez out of the way. "Sit down," he said curtly to John. "All of you, sit down." Without a word, the gunner, his mate, and the boys took their places at the table. "Now then." Mr. Torse's small round face, normally so cheerful, had lengthened with severity. "I want the truth, John Barr. All of it. Accusations has been made against you. Thieves on a ship is what none of us wants. Shipmates must sleep easy in their hammocks, knowing that their few possessions are safe and sound. What have you to say for yourself?" John took a deep breath. The injustice of the accusation had stung him to fury. He was afraid he would violently lose his temper. "I never even touched Nate's penknife," he began, trying to control the rage in his voice. "He took it against me as soon as I came on board. I didn't do anything to him. First he tried to upset my dinner, and then—" Mr. Torse held up his hand. "Kit here has spoken for you as regards the penknife. What you said correct, Kit. You're on your honour to tell the truth." Kit nodded, his face reflecting the seriousness of the occasion. "Yes, Mr. Torse. I did see Nate put his knife in his pocket. John couldn't have taken it. Nate did try to spill John's dinner. He's a nasty boy, Mr. Torse. He was nasty to all of us. "We are not concerning ourselves with Nate," said Mr. Torse, "but with John. John, we accept Kit's evidence. You did not steal Nate's knife." John shuddered with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Torse," he managed to say. "But," Mr. Torse's forefinger tapped the table, "other things was said. Mr. Higgins expressed the belief that you have about you stolen property. Is this true?" His brown eyes, clear and stern, stared into John's. John hesitated, unsure whom he could trust. He looked sideways at Kit, taking courage at his reassuringly trusting smile, then back at Mr. Torse, and down at the table. At last he came to a decision. "No," he said, "but there's something I don't understand. Please can I tell you what's happened? I'd like to tell you all of it." It took nearly half an hour to recount the whole story, starting with the loss of Luxton in Mr. Halkett's office, the murder of Mr. Sweeney in the Close, the furious mob, the press gang in Leith, the unexpected appearance of Mr. Creech on board the receiving ship, and his strange, desperate attempts to acquire the satchel. "So, where's the satchel now?" The dent between Mr. Torse's eyebrows had been getting deeper as he tried to follow the complicated tale. "Well," said John reluctantly, "it was there when I untied my bundle. I put it away with the other things in Kit's chest." "You mean it's disappeared since you boarded the ship?" Mr. Torse's eyebrows had risen now, wrinkling the leathery skin of his tanned forehead into deep lines. John looked at Kit, whose eyes had opened in a question. John nodded. Kit stood up from the table and dived under the gun. He wriggled out again and held the satchel up for everyone to see. "How in heaven's name did it get down there?" said Chavez Barton, who had been following John's story open-mouthed, but with increasing bewilderment. "I hid it," said Kit, looking anxiously at Mr. Torse. "I reckon there was some trouble in store for John. We heard Nate and Mr. Higgins talking in secret when we went down to the purser's for John's hammock. Something to do with John's gear being stowed, and something that was supposed to be in it. I saw how surprised John was when he saw the satchel. I suppose I just guessed. I don't know why. I thought it was best to hide it." He faltered to a stop. Mr. Torse held out his hand to the satchel, undid the clasp, and pulled out the contents and laid them on the table. Now then, what do we have here? Everyone bent curiously to look. John picked up the dog-eared papers and leafed through them. This is, I don't know. Oh yes, it says bill of sale. It's for our cows at Luxton. And this is a lease on a field. Mr. Torse took it from him and laid it aside. Here's a letter, said Tom, been trying to spell out the first line. Put that down, Tom. Sorry, sir, mumbled Tom, blushing. It's from my mother. The last one before she died, said John, hastily taking it and folding it up. Nothing. There's nothing here of note. Mr. Torse was placing the papers in a pile. He scrutinised each in turn. Contract for a bushel of wheat. Deed of covenant, but out of date. The last will and testament of one Joseph Barr. A marriage settlement. A warrant. Hello, what's this? He held up to a lantern a little booklet and rifled through the papers. It was made up of a few thin pages of India paper, on which were written, in tiny spidery hand, a small column of numbers, facing corresponding columns of words. I don't think I've ever seen that before, John said, wrinkling his brow as memory knocked faintly in the back of his mind. I don't know what it could be. Some kind of accounts, perhaps? It's not my father's hand. Mr. Torse held up the paper to the lantern and peered at it closely. Could be accounts, I suppose, he said doubtfully. Plenty of numbers, anyway. I can't make heads or tail of it at all. He put the paper down on the table. Jabez picked it up and squinted at it. Horace ducked his head down and tried to take a peck at it. Jabez jerked it out the parrot's way, accidentally hitting the lantern, which began to swing wildly. Jabez put the paper down, steadied the lantern, and tapped Horace smartly on the beak. You mind your manners, Horace. Don't you go nibbling at what don't belong to you. Put them papers away, lad, Mr. Torse said to John. There's a bit of a mystery here. It's my belief that this Mr. Creech of yours, please sir, he's not mine, objected John, revolted. You know what I mean. It's my belief he's taken hold of a mistaken idea about the contents of this here satchel. There's nothing there of value that I can see. It's what young Nate Claypole was doing I don't understand. Mr. Higgins knows Mr. Creech, said John. I saw 'em talking together on the receiving ship. Mr. Higgins and Nate were talking secrets together down below. Officers' accusations against an officer on board this ship is what I won't tolerate, not for any reason. Mr. Torse fixed John with an awful frown. The way of boatswain's mates is wondrous strange, and passing all knowledge. It's not for jumped-up boys to question them. Keep this satchel tucked away and out of sight. That's my advice. We don't want no more poking and prying and mysteries here. Now, we'll close the whole sorry business. I hereby state, young John, you are free of all suspicion. I believe you have told us the whole truth. No one could make up a story such as that anyways. I ain't never heard a thing to match it, though most men in the Navy have a tale to tell would curl the hair of a mermaid. Nothing exciting ever happened to me, Tom said regretfully. My father sent me to sea. I'm to work for him on his brig, trading out of air, while I'm learned to be a seaman. He said the training's finer in the Navy. I ran away from my master, said Davy with simple pride. Laid him out with a good blow to the jaw first, flat as a flounder, even though he's the biggest blacksmith in Rye. Couldn't have done it if he hadn't been drunk. He won't bully me ever again, will he, Mr. Barton? He will not, Davy, so long as you behave yourself. I'm a good seaman, and look after them animals, same as you're told, said Jabez comfortably. John turned expectantly towards Kit. hoping to hear his story. But Kit was inspecting the sole of his foot, trying to put out a splinter with his fingernails. "Don't think too hard of Nate, boys," Mr. Torse said into the silence. "Beaten and starved he was, all his life, like a puppy no one wanted. It's no surprise his character turned out as sour as milk that's left to curdle. I was sorry for the lad, but there was no making a gunner of him. What's the first rule of gunnery, Tom?" "To maintain the discipline of the gun crew and obey the gun captain at all times," rapped out Tom. "And the second, Kit?" "To remain steady under fire," said Kit, without lifting his eyes from his foot, "even if the head's shot away from your shoulders." "That's enough of your sauce." "What's the third, Davy?" To be, speed, quick," Davy brought out triumphantly. "Good lad. Now then, boys, keep yourselves quiet and out of mischief till it's time to pipe down the hammocks. I have business with Mr. Erskine." By the time the short supper of ship's biscuit, cheese, and cocoa had been taken, and the hammocks had been fetched down from the decks above, John was so tired that he would have fallen asleep anywhere, standing, sitting, or lying down, if he had been left alone for a moment. He was still just awake when Tom showed him how to untie his hammock, hook it between two beams, and shake out the pillow and blanket it contained. He was yawning so hard his jaw felt it would crack right open as he bent to take off his shoes, barely noticing he was the only one to do so, as the others were all barefooted. It was harder than he'd expected, climbing into his hammock. It rolled away from under him, tipping him out. He summoned up a sleepy smile at the others, who were laughing at his clumsy efforts. And, at last, with a desperate thrust of his feet, he managed to get in and stay in. He had barely pulled the blanket over himself before he fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. The pipe of the boatswain's whistle, shouts of "Larboard watch ahoy!" curses, groans, and the scuffle of men's feet coming from the far side of the canvas jerked him awake. He lay with his eyes wide open in the dark, wondering for a long moment what kind of dream he'd fallen into. The events of yesterday churned through his mind. He turned over and cried out with fright as he nearly tipped himself out of the hammock. "Go back to sleep," came Tom's sleepy voice from the hammock, only a hand's breadth away to his left. "It's only the watch changes. You don't have to go. It's still just the wee small hours." John grunted in reply. Although it was cold, the air, heavy with the smells of tarry ropes, stale breath, and unwashed men, was almost too close to breathe. There were strange sounds all around. Jarvis Barton's deep, growling snores. Lighter ones, ending in a whistle, from behind the partition, marking off Mr. Torse's tiny cabin. Kind of whimpering from where Davy slept. Bumps and cries. The clang of a bell, and the endless straining creak of the ship's wooden beams. "Where are you, father?" he thought. "Are you awake? Are you thinking of me?" A feeling of dreadful sadness swept across him. He sniffed, rubbing the end of the blanket savagely across his nose. Then he felt a hand, from the right, coming from where Kit slept. It took hold of the edge of his hammock and gave it a shove, so that it swung gently a little from side to side. The sensation was wonderfully comforting, as if he were a baby being rocked in his cradle. And quite suddenly, he was asleep again.